Hey guys, and welcome to a video that complements the SATS ME core guide you can find in the description. I hope to go through all of the steps required to build the large controller that y'all have been asking for. Now with this video, I hope to add a little bit more nuance to topics that are missing from the guide. And after all, it's not an AE2 guide, it's a controller guide. So I'm your guy. I'll walk you through the steps and the techniques used. And hopefully you can build the 21,000 channel controller yourself by the end of this. So to build big, you gotta start small. This is the ME controller. Each face of this bad boy can support 32 channels, and it is basically the hub of your network. It's the brains behind everything else. And it receives power from any one of its faces. Here I'm choosing the top. Now you can only ever have one controller in a network, but a controller can be a multi-block. And building the multi-block follows a certain set of rules. One of the major ones being that the controller mustn't exceed a 7x7x7 cube. And if you do something wrong, you'll know because the controller turns red instead of its pretty rainbow colors. Now there are other rules to do with the placement of multi-block controllers, to do with what shapes you can build, and one of the major rules to keep in mind is the fact that you cannot make cross intersections. However, T-shapes or funny shapes like this corner are completely fine. So to actually get started with the guide part of the video, I'd recommend starting a few blocks above the ground just so you have access to the bottoms of the controllers, and start off with building the square shape. Now I am going to build the core part first and then the subnet controller afterwards, because the subnet controller can go anywhere. And then you can go ahead and start building up this square to be a 3x3 cube with a hollow inside. Like so. After this, to get started with what's going to be the repeating unit that forms this bigger cube, you're going to put down a plus shape here and a plus shape here and one on the top. And with this in place, your next 3x3s will go here, here, and here. Kind of like that. Now you can just repeat that entire pattern again to finish out the rest of the cube. I'll cut to when I'm done. And you'll know you've done this correctly when it looks sort of like this, with a plus shape in the middle, a hole that goes through the middle, all the way through, and then 3x3s that also have holes going down all the way through on each corner. Now for the next part of this, to connect all of these with P2P tunnels, it is crucial that you don't use regular Fluix smart cables. They need to be dyed any color, and that is because the colored cables won't connect to each other, while these cables, the regular cables, connect to everything else. We don't want that happening. And for the record, this is also true for the dense cables. These don't connect to each other, but the Fluix will connect to both. Now, before we go on and connect up all of our P2P tunnels, it is also important to note the logic behind the way they're connected. Each one of the smart cables can carry 8 channels, but the dense cables carry 32, and the wireless connector also only supports 32. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is group up all of these P2P tunnels in groups of 32 and bundle them together to connect to a wireless connector. Now to finally, with all of that information out of the way, get down to putting our P2P tunnels on these faces. Now it's important to note that if you're going to be building this, that you only put down the P2P tunnels on the edges on one axis at a time. So here I have filled in the left edge and the right edge, so I'm not going to fill in the top edge and the bottom edge. Everything else, however, is fair game. And don't forget the middle here. Now with this cross in place, we can go ahead and start connecting up our P2P tunnels. So that has 4 P2P tunnels, that's 5. Now if I'm to connect this like this, that is another 4. And 4 plus 4 plus 1 is more than 8. So this guy would have to become a smart cable. And you mirror this on the other side, exactly like that. Now for the top and bottom, that is a little bit simpler because that is only 5 extra connections. So you can just go ahead and do that. And for the middle bit, you can just simply put down cables like this. You finish off with a wireless connector, which we will have to paint the same color as the cables, because these wireless connectors can pass channels between them, and of course, since the cables can connect to each other, the wireless connectors can too. Now, to apply color to any one of these ME devices, you would use something called a color applicator. And even the guide page for this bad boy is a little bit unhelpful, so I hope to explain this in one shot. You put down an ME chest and you treat this as if it's any old ME drive. So you put this in there, now you can access the top, and once you load it full of dyes, you can pull your color applicator back out. And to use the color applicator, you can shift right click the air or shift scroll wheel to swap between the different colors. And since my color is purple, I would swap until I find purple. And I would have to go and just simply shift right click. Now you can see that the device is colored purple. Armed with all of this knowledge, I'm going to go ahead and put down the next 32 on each of these 4 corners. That was easy enough. Now for the next bit, I'm going to put down a post on each of these corners. And since each of these are 8 channels, these are fully saturated connections, so I'll have to swap to using dense cables for the next bit. And just as before, I put another wireless connector down in the middle. Now again, this one would need to be dyed white to match its cables and to make sure it doesn't connect to the purple one behind it. Now that this entire face is done, I hope you remember I told you guys to leave the top and bottom alone if you're doing the left and right in a previous step. And that is because in the next face, you would have the empty spot in the left and you would fill in the top and bottom. Exactly like so. Now you would follow the same steps as before to connect up all of these. You would use smart cable to connect up the ones in the middle and then use dense cables to connect the ones from the edges. And once you're done with that, you can go ahead and put down your controller and shift right click it with the corresponding color. Now for the purposes of keeping this guide video to the point, I'm not going to go through every single face, neither am I going to build every single face. The pattern effectively repeats itself, where you take the next 32 channels, build out the posts, put another wireless connector on top, color it its favorite color, which in this case will be yellow, and then you would go to the next face, rotate the pattern by 90 degrees, so if the left side and the right side are filled in, you would have to fill in the top and the bottom, connect them up the same way. I'm now going to skip forward to the section where you're building the inside corners, and those are what I had the most troubles with personally. So you guys might be wondering why I spent a little bit of time building this glass cube, and with this glass structure, I hope to better help you guys visualize what the process is for filling out the interior corners, because these ones are tricky. Now, this is what the empty spaces inside the 7x7 controller look like at the moment. I have not put in the exact middle because that's going to be one of the later steps. So now for each one of these tinted glass blocks, you would only have 4 controllers in contact with its faces, and that is true for every single one of these on the inside. So you can only add 8 tinted glass blocks to every wireless connector in the middle of this. Now, funnily enough, even though the guide says so, the exact order in which these are placed doesn't exactly matter as long as the total number does not exceed 8. And I do note for a fact that the guide mentions that you should build specific shapes in specific places, but that is more of a tool to help you keep track of what's going where. As long as you keep track and count that no more than 8 connections have been made, you can build something like this, and then you can have 32 channels going into a single connector, as this is 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, and 32. Now, in fact, for the top left interior corner, I'm going to build exactly this guy. Now, to get into a space that small, it's easiest done with a personal shrinking device set to its lowest setting. And in fact, when you're this small and have some form of light, you can very easily sneak into the little crevices that are left behind after these 3D models are placed in. And now that we're tiny, I can simply fly in the middle of this guy and start putting down the P2P tunnels on these faces. So each cube has 6 faces, and if every face has 4 P2P tunnels, the tunnels that I'm adding right now add up to be 24. And the 2 extras, which would add up to 32 finally, in my demo there in glass, were made to the right and to the bottom. So I'm going to do the exact same right here. Now that all of those P2P tunnels are in place, I can start putting down the cables that would eventually connect to the wireless connector in the middle. And I like to give myself a way out, so I'm going to put the one that is connecting to the face last. So the connector goes here. I would have to swap to the color red because the cables are red. Eventually, here we go. That's red. And now I can just fly out. And with that, I have now replicated this pattern in P2P connections on the inside of that corner. Now your next steps would look something like this. You would pick another corner and you would put down 4 P2P tunnels on every face you get an opportunity to put down on. And now you have 32 P2P tunnels, which would connect into this guy right here. Then you would move on to your next corner, do the same thing again, and eventually you would run out of space to put down 32 channels. And that situation looks something like this. Once you've filled out 6 out of the 8 corners with 32 channels, you would be left with 2 that have 24. This guy and the guy in the opposite corner behind it. Now, this isn't strictly necessary that it would play out exactly like this. In fact, in my survival controller, because I built it without a guide, but with intuition instead, I have 4 corners with 32 channels and 4 corners with 28. The total channel count remains the same, which is 21,504, but that is because what's the most important and what's essential is the fact that every single face has a P2P tunnel, and they're all connected to wireless controllers at the end. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and build out every single corner in this guide, and I'm hoping that the logic I've presented here and the examples that I've done have empowered you to go ahead and do it yourself. Like I mentioned, the exact numbers and the placements aren't important as long as they're all connected, are of different colors so they don't send channels across to each other, and everything terminates in a wireless connection. You should be okay. So the next phase of the build takes us to the very middle of this controller, where, just as before, and everywhere else, we spam the faces with P2P tunnels. Now that that's done, you can go ahead and put down your connector and color it, in this case, red, as it was red from previous endeavors. I'm now going to take the red cable and make this plus shape, exactly like so. And you would just simply mirror the setup on the other side. So the same 16 P2P tunnels and a controller in the middle. Just remember that the controller would have to be different from the ones around it and the cables around it too. In this case, it can be red, so I'm making it red again. And that leaves the slice in the middle. Now for the slice in the middle, you would basically go through the same exercise again, where you would put down P2P tunnels, after which you can go ahead and put down your connector. You would then have to use a cable color that is different from all sides, so a color that is different from the bottom, from the left, and from the front. And in this case, I'm going with white, but do note that you would then have to color the wireless connector the same color. And so if I colored this connector to be white, and then connect these up, you can see that none of these connect to each other. The white cable connects to the white controller, and you can slowly back out and fill in the space. And if you repeat all of these steps for every single corner and every single face, you should be done. You should have all 21,504 channels connected via P2P into wireless connectors. Now we move on to the second phase, and that will be building the subcontroller. Now to build the subcontroller, the guide says you gotta make a 3x3 hollow cube beneath the controller there, but I would like to once again explain the logic behind it and do it a little differently in the video. And to do that, we would have to take a quick head count for all of the wireless connectors used. So the 6 faces have 2 wireless connectors each, which adds up to 12. There's 8 corners, which adds up to 20. And then there's 3 connectors in the middle, which adds up to 23. Except not every single one of those 23 connectors has a full 32 channel connection. Some of them have, in this case, 24. In the case of the middle of the controller, some of them have 16. But the total channel count being input into the subcontroller will be 21,504. If we divide that number by 32, which is the total number of channels supported by a face, we get 21. So we get 23 faces of input and 21 faces of output. So what does all of that math actually mean, Kesa? Well, the gist of it is the fact that as long as whatever you build has 44 faces available for you to use, the exact shape of your controller doesn't matter. So I'm just going to throw something together and hopefully it works. And so, completely on a whim, I've chosen this to be the shape of my subcontroller. Now, what I'm going to do next is put down all of the wireless connectors, all 23 of them, and link them up back to their original ones in the main controller there. And again, I've chosen to put down my 23 wireless connectors like so. And I'll now go ahead and shift right click the air with the setup card to clear its setting, right click a connector to bind it, and then right click the other connector to bind that connector to this connector. And then I can do the same here where I shift right click the purple connector, and then go ahead and right click the connector over here. And while connecting these up, I've noticed that I've made a mistake here. This block is supposed to be a dense cable, not a regular cable. And that is because of the total number of channels going through here. There we go. And I've just gone back to make sure, and sure enough, I have made the same mistake over here. The block that connects out of the middle has to be a dense cable, and it shows dense cables in the guide too. I made this mistake probably because I do it a little differently in my survival world, where I pull out a cable and then use cable anchors to separate these cables, so the middle cable goes directly into the face. Minor grievances aside, I have now connected up all of my connections. In my case, there's only 7, but hopefully you have all 23. And I now have all of their corresponding cables and connections listed as a part of this network. So now, to finally use a system like this, you would have to go find a connection spot to your subcontroller where you would be able to put down a P2P tunnel. Then you can run over to your main controller, shift right click the memory card to make sure it's clear, shift right click a P2P tunnel to get its signature, and then right click your end P2P tunnel to make that the input and this the output. And with both devices online, this P2P tunnel should serve as a direct connection to that face of the controller right there, which is to say you should now have 32 channels of bandwidth to do whatever you want with. So now that I've saturated this connection, let's trace back to the controller, shall we? I have 32 channels going into this P2P tunnel, which serves as a single device on this dense cable right here. So it's using a single channel, which goes into the face of this controller right here. Now this controller eventually connects to this wireless connector, which is right here. Now this wireless connector is then connected to all of these P2Ps and eventually this P2P right here, which then connects to this ME controller. Now for the P2P tunnels, in this case, what's happening on the outside of the P2P tunnel is a separate network than the inside. So that controller only sees P2P tunnels and no devices. On the other hand, this controller sees 22 ME drives and 10 extended interfaces. That is because to this controller, this P2P tunnel is a direct connection to a lime green dense cable. These serve as portals, taking that point to this point, thus P2P. Now let's walk through a slightly different scenario, one where you don't end up saturating the connection and you only use some of the 32 channels, in this case 6. Does that mean that this P2P tunnel is done for and can never be used again? Never used to its fullest potential? No. What I can do is with a cleared memory card, I can shift right click this and I can pull off another connection and another P2P tunnel, which I can link to the same P2P tunnel. The P2P tunnels are a single input, multiple output system in this case. And hypothetically, that means that this guy now has access to the full 26 remaining channels on this P2P tunnel. And I figured why leave that as a hypothetical when I can just prove it. So here I have 25 pattern writers connected onto this dense cable. And I am hypothesizing that this can only support 26 because the other 6 are over there. So if I put down 26, the device comes online just as all the others, but the 27th is now missing a channel. And that should pretty much be everything you need to know about this sort of setup and this particular controller and how to build it. Now, I do have a little bit of a nitpick with how the controller is presented, because the controller says in the guide that it is a 21504 controller, except that isn't truly the case because one of its faces got lost to a quartz fiber. I have found a way around that, and let me just set that up for you real quick. So having removed that ender gate, this controller is slowly losing its charge, trying to keep the network alive, so I have to rush ever so slightly. So I would pull off a connection just as before from the subcontroller, put down a P2P, I would take any P2P connection from the main controller, consider this an output, and then I can build whatever I want on the other side. But what I have to do is put down an energy acceptor with some sort of power going into it. Now what this does is, without using a channel, it is powering what is essentially connected directly to the face of the controller. So it's actually no different than doing one of these. And of course this powers the controller on. And to the big controller, this is what it sees. And of course, since if this case works, it works in this case too. You can see it slowly discharges, but then once it falls to a low enough number, it just recharges back to 3.35 million or mega FE. And that way, you can have P2P tunnels on every single face to fully utilize the 21,504 channels, instead of losing 32 from that and ending up with 21,472 off the top of my head. Now I can do something extremely similar with the subcontroller, and I can power it off of the same connection here. So it's steadily losing its charge without the gate. And what I can do is, with a couple of quartz fibers, isolate these two networks from each other and simply connect this into this. In fact, I don't even think I need that, because this cable would then send power through to here. And of course, its energy usage was high, but it's now going low because its stored power has maxed out. Perfect. Now, what's important to note, and I think confuses a lot of people initially, is the concept of P2P channels versus regular channels. This single channel in the Lime Smart ME cable is a P2P channel because it's a single P2P tunnel that is connected to this smart cable over here. Now, this guy has a bunch of channels, in this case 0 because there's nothing connected, but it has no P2P tunnels on its network. All of the P2P tunnels are on the subcontroller's network. So in this case, the subcontroller is a purely P2P management controller. There is no actual channels going through. What's also important to note is that if you ever accidentally mix up your regular channels and your P2P channels, you will end up with a red and rainbow dance, where every time the network tries to boot, it realizes that the P2P channels and the regular channels are mixed, and if that ever happens, then you have a recursive problem where this P2P channel can go through itself and then go through itself, and of course that breaks things. So yeah, with all of this, I believe that you should now be capable of building your own massive controllers. And if you want to see the type of shenanigans that I get up to, you should go watch my Ultimods 10 playlist. Peace out, everybody.